Greetings and welcome. My name is Keitra Armstrong. I'm a professor in sport management at the School of Kinesiology. I'm also the director for the Center for Race and Ethnicity in Sport. I'm the faculty athletic representative also here at the University of Michigan. And I was a former Division I student athlete, coach, and administrator. I am so delighted to be your host this afternoon as we discuss race, sport, restorative justice, and the implications for higher education. Now, your video and your audios have been muted. And I also want to remind you that this is being recorded. Now, if you want to send some questions to us or comments, you can do so by utilizing the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we get into the crux of the matter, there's a few people I have to say a huge thank you to. And I'd like to begin with my kinesiology staff. So I want to say a huge thank you to Emily Matthews, who's the director of our marketing and communications. Thanks to Devaney Rosebrock, who is our events and alumni engagement manager. And I also want to say a huge thank you to our partners at the National Center for Institutional Diversity here at the University of Michigan. So that's where Dr. Tabby Chavis is the director, Dr. Marie Ting is the associate director, and Dr. Megan Segoshi is a scholar and community engagement program lead. So I told you already that I'm so excited to be here. And one of the reasons why, in addition to those of you in Zoom land joining us, is because I think that I've assembled an all-star dream team of scholar activists who are also former student athletes in some capacity. And they're going to be leading our discussion today. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. And I'm going to do so in alphabetical order. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Albert Y. Bimper. Dr. Bimper presently serves as the Assistant Vice President, the Senior Associate Athletics Director with oversight for Student Athlete Support Services and all of the diversity and inclusion efforts within the athletic department at Colorado State University. He also holds the rank of Associate Professor with appointments in both Sport Management and African American Studies in the College of Liberal Arts. Dr. Bimper serves as the founding director for the sport management program at Colorado State University. He has published numerous academic journals, and he has a self-authored book that spans the topic of intercollegiate athletics, education, cultural studies, and the sociology of sport. And it's entitled Black Collegiate Athletes and the Neoliberal State, Dreaming from Bended Knee, Sport, Identity, and Culture. Welcome, Dr. Bimper. The next panelist I'd like to introduce to you is Dr. Joseph N. Cooper. Dr. Cooper is the Dr. J. Keith Motley Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership and Administration, and he's Associate Professor in the Leadership and Education in the Department of College of Education and Human Development, that's a mouthful, at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. His research agenda focuses on the intersection between sport, education, race, and culture. And he has an emphasis on sport involvement as a catalyst for holistic development. He is also the faculty founder of Collective Uplift. That's an organization designed to educate, empower, inspire, and support individuals to maximize their holistic potential within and beyond sports. He is the author of From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, Black Male Holistic Underdevelopment Through Sport and Miseducation. And he has a forthcoming book entitled A Legacy of African American Resistance and Activism Through Sport. Welcome, Dr. Joseph Cooper. The next panelist I want you to meet is Dr. Deniece Dortch. Dr. Dortch is a visiting assistant professor in higher education administration in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University. Her research and teaching, it grapples with systemic oppression across multiple axes. She uses critical approaches to understand how African-American students experience and respond to race and racism at predominantly white institutions of higher education. Dr. Dortch studies the socialization of students of color, how the psychological violence and fear is experienced and manifested and reproduced in the academy, racial agency and self-efficacy and how they impact persistence in education, and the sense of belonging of students of color at predominantly white institutions. She also is one of the co-founders of Sista to Sista, and that is a co-curricular program that's designed to support Black female student athletes. So welcome, Dr. Deniece Dortch. And last but not least is Dr. Lori Latrice Martin. Dr. Martin is a professor in African and African American Studies program in the Department of Sociology at Louisiana State University. She is also the chair of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Diversity Committee. And she is LSU's faculty athletic representative. She is the author of many, many scholarly works. Her most recent publication includes Black Women as Leaders, Big Box Schools, White Sports, Black Sports, and Pay to Play. She is also the editor of a book entitled Out of Bounds, Racism and the Black Athlete. And she has two forthcoming books, Introduction to Africana Demography and America in Denial. Welcome, Dr. Latrice Martin. So thank you so much, panelists, for agreeing to participate in what I am sure will be a very fun and engaging discussion. Now, I'm going to pose some general questions, but then I'll also have some questions that are specifically tied to your areas of expertise. And I've also I want to say thank you to the audience members for the question that you submitted in advance. I've also tried to work those questions into our discussion. So now that we know each other, without further ado, let's get started. Now, there's been lots of consternation about the racial wrongs in education, in athletics. There's a lot that's going wrong. But you know, all of us are former student athletes. We understand that there are also some really good benefits. And there's some things that are going right in this space when we think about race, sport, and higher education. So I'd like the panelists to begin. We're going to start on a positive note, a lighter note, before we get into the depths and the darkness of racism. I want you to talk about, when you think about race, sport, and higher education, what's working for the Black student athletes? Dr. Martin, lead us off.
Sure. So first, let me thank you, Dr. Armstrong, for this opportunity. And I'm really honored to be on this panel with these distinguished scholars, and thank everyone on the Zoom call. I will say that I am excited about some of the things that I'm seeing at LSU regarding Black student athletes and their supporters. So I think that this is a special time in the history of race and sports, such that you have Black student athletes organizing. So that's happened at LSU, where they're now an official organization where their goal is to raise awareness about the challenges that Black student athletes face. And they have the support of the athletic department, so they have a direct line to the leadership, the athletic leadership development, the Athletic Leadership Council on Diversity. And so they can share with them what their concerns are, and hopefully that will lead to real action. And they also have the support of dynamic people within the athletic department and on the academic side. So I've been really impressed, for example, with the women's basketball coach, Coach Nikki Vargas. She is, just trying to motivate and to empower and to, help the students improve their leadership skills and help them to, create the agenda that they want to set forward, and to just really be supportive. So it's just exciting to see student athletes, trying to do what they can do despite the potential risks that they might face from within the athletic department, on their teams, and with the broader community.
Very good, great. Who wants to go next? Yes, Dr. Cooper.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Echo Dr. Martin's sentiments. Honored to be on this esteemed panel with my colleagues, and want to thank the University of Michigan and everyone involved in organizing this webinar, and thank you for all the attendees for taking time out of your day to engage with us on this very important topic. When I think about what's working for Black college athletes, I look at it from a decentralized way. And what I mean by that is at certain institutions, certain things are working better than others. When I think about somewhere like the University of Texas, where they have the Black Student Athlete Summit, and I know for several years that I've attended that summit, Shaka Smart, who is an African-American, the head coach of the men's basketball team there, he's brought some of the players on his team to the summit and to engage with the scholars, practitioners. And so those are things that are working. I know at Dr. Bimper's school, they had a program called Rambition. Dr. Dortch co-founded Sister to Sister with Dr. Carter Francique. I started Collective Uplift with a group of student athletes, college athletes at UConn. We started Collective Uplift. So you've got institutions that have faculty, staff, coaches, administrators who are caring about the holistic well-being of the college athletes, who are not only creating programs and initiatives, but also creating partnerships. And one of the things that I'm sure we're going to talk about more in depth throughout our conversation is that the athletic department doesn't operate or exist in a silo. And Black college athletes, their lives, their identities, their experiences, and their relationships don't exist in a silo either. So a lot of what we will be talking about, what works at different institutions, is partnerships. My native state of North Carolina, where there are 11 HBCUs that are located, that's another thing. I know we're primarily going to be talking about Black college athlete at historically white institutions, but there are some great things happening at our historically Black colleges and universities as well. Prior to the current state of our social unrest and afterwards, which speaks to what Dr. Martin talked about, is this level of socio-cultural consciousness, social political consciousness, and a level of connectivity to a cause bigger than yourself, bigger than the uniform that you wear. So I'll stop there, but I did want to just highlight that there's some great initiatives, programs, and leaders doing great work all across the country.
Right. Absolutely. And we will delve into some of those things and let you share with us your experiences, particularly with the nature of the HBCU environment. Dr. Bimper, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll begin with also offering a thank you to the invitation to join this panel, and thank you to all of those that are joining the webinar. Thank you to the University of Michigan as well. I think for me, I'll build off of what has been said. I agree with the framing that there are many institutions that have some programming and different initiatives that are lending themselves to a better experience for our Black athletes in ways that maybe didn't exist years ago. I myself am a product of the intercollegiate athletic system and model. As a former athlete at the institution that I now serve at, I'm optimistic, and I do believe that there is pathways to really develop our young men and women. But and while I'll reserve my but while we're critiquing, I do think there's been many pathways created for leadership. I think there's been ways that student athletes can find their ways into various leadership capacities within the athletic department and across the university. Working at a land-grant institution, the idea of access to education and inviting those and welcoming those with the talents and desire to pursue an education that can go back into the communities and create impact. I think it's offered those opportunities as well. So it's, there's some, obviously some, it's not all positive, and there's a lot of work to be done and challenges to face. I think I also work at an institution historically white, predominantly white, using those descriptors very intentionally. That my population of student athletes is one of the most diverse populations across the campus, and so it has afforded certain ways of engaging these difficult discussions in ways I also don't see fully engaged across our campus. So there's that kind of experience that our student athletes get to some degree that I think it is working or it could be described as working in that way.
Right. Very good. Dr. Dortch, what would you like to add?
So thank you to the University of Michigan. I'm also excited to be participating in this panel as well. And thank you, Dr. Cooper, for the shout out. I will say though, the only other thing that I would have to add, because the panelists have already pretty much covered everything, is that there are institutions that are working to develop programs, that have developed programs that focus on students after their collegiate experience as well. And so allowing for them to have space to either go into the field of athletics without having to think about whether they want to play professional sports. I also think that in addition to the socio-political moment, there is a rise in racial agency for student athletes that I'm seeing, that I'm also really excited about, as they're using their collective power and their financial power and really exercising that in such a way to make real cultural shifts at their universities. And so we're seeing bits of that happening right now. And I think that that's something that is working well. And if we could just harness that momentum and exercise those same tactics at institutions around the country, we will begin to see much more movement in the direction of racial justice.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you all. And as some of you alluded to, sport has led the charge of this experiment of racial integration. And so as Dr. Bimper mentioned, there's some things that athletics are doing that the university proper could probably benefit from. So what I want to do now is offer some nuance to our conversation. And I want to start with you, Dr. Dortch, as an expert in race and higher education. How would you compare the Black student athlete experience or the Black student experience to other students, white students at predominantly white institutions? We've talked about what's good, but let's nuance it a little bit before we get into the injustices. Let's offer some nuance and say, well, what's different? How are the Black student athletes having a different experience in comparison to the white students? And I know you've done research with with women, and how do the male Black students differ from the female Black students? So give me some nuance.
Okay. All right. So that was a lot. So this is, okay. So overall, I will say that African-American students that I found, according to my research, are experiencing what I describe as psychological warfare. And so that is a combination of psychological violence, which is they're experiencing dehumanization, microaggressions, and all sorts of forms of racism that are impacting them psychologically, which essentially is violent. And then they're experiencing fear on their college campuses. In higher education, essentially, we are teaching students to be afraid, to not speak up, that there will be consequences that will be detrimental to their educational experience and then their persistence. And so we essentially teach these pedagogical practices of fear. Then there's the students are experiencing isolation, both structural isolation, being one of very few in programs or departments or on teams, especially for those that would be considered like non-income generating sports. So they may be both doubly or triply marginalized in that way. And then they're also experiencing tokenism, so the practice of perfunctory gestures toward racialized inclusion. And so that essentially is the experience for a lot of Black folks on campuses that are predominantly white. And then I also spend a little bit of time on how they think about themselves inside that experience and then what they do about it. And so how that's different. So if that's the experience for sort of Black people writ large, perhaps, then if we sort of pare that down to think about, if we juxtapose that to white students and then talk about the Black student athlete, if we juxtapose that to white students, for example, white students receive the message that this community or their institutions are for them. And so Bell Hooks, actually, she has this quote in, it is, I believe, in teaching community, right? And so there's these like unwritten rules that she says that to build community requires a vigilant awareness of the work we have to do to continue to undermine the socialization that leads us to behave in ways that perpetuate domination. And so in that same book, she says that Black people and people of color, when they're one of few in these settings, that what's happening is that white people at these institutions are considered to be the host and we are the guest, right? And so when we're moving in these spaces are designed with white people in mind. They were built, created, and exist for their good, right? And although the purpose of education might be to serve the public good, it is for their good. They create the rules and the policies. They determine which one of us, Black people, are okay to enter into their spaces, right? And so what white people learn, the message that they're receiving is that this is their home, right? They are not guests, this is their home. Whereas we're taught that we are privileged guests and we should be grateful that we are here and that they're taking our money, and that essentially we're the guests, right? We're here 3 or 4 years and now be on your way. But in the meantime, I think that that's damaging to our experience, which is why we have all these climate studies and why, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about belonging and not feeling like we belong and not feeling like we're part of this university settings and structures and that sort of thing. So I think that those are some of the fundamental differences between Black students and white students in their experiences. Not to say that a white student couldn't experience fear, or not to say they couldn't experience low levels of self-efficacy, but it's not to the same degree, nor is it consistent or rooted in systemic racism and white supremacy.
But wonderful, excellent, comprehensive response, and I really appreciate that. And so you talk about, you know, what happens when you feel like, you know, you are a guest in a place that people expect for you to call your home. And so you talk about the psychological challenges that poses for Black student athletes. That's not to the same extent for white student athletes. And I want to also just say, and I should have said this at the outset, that we know the Black athlete, that term is not a monolith. So we know that the Black student athlete experience is contoured in a number of ways based on social class, based on the sport they play, based on their own level of cultural assimilation. So I just want to be sure that it is not my intention or our intention to paint the Black athlete experience with a broad brush. So we recognize the nuances. However, for the purpose of this conversation, we are speaking in generalities, but I just wanted to say that. And I want to go to you, Dr. Bimper. Dr. Dortch talked about, you know, the psychological harm and the damage and what it does to the psyche if you're a Black student on a white college campus that you're fighting to belong, right? It's that notion of the imposter syndrome, always having to prove that you belong in this space. Dr. Bimper, you write a lot about identity, and you talk about the salience of racial identity and how that impacts the Black student athletes in the classroom and in competition. Talk about the role of racial identity in impacting the Black student athlete experience.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And before I go there, I might add that I think to your last question, the ways in which athletes that I've worked with in practice, I guess, and then also and have participated and really been involved with through the research, right? They speak to their experience as kind of fragmented support, kind of disjointed support in terms of being supported momentarily during competition, but, you know, come Monday, all of a sudden, right, feeling very isolated as a word that was used earlier. The idea of also a very magnified experience, you know, anywhere you go, right, there's this either kind of label or identification of you as an athlete. And, you know, where that can be positive, it can also, it's very stereotypical and can lead to a lot of negative experiences as well. And then I'd also just offer the experience being problematically efficient, that things are very managed in a way that gets someone through or gets them to graduation without a lot of education sometimes. And so those become some, I think, context for understanding, again, in generality to some degree, what that experience might be for many athletes as they kind of navigate and matriculate through the institution. In terms of identity work, yeah, I mean, we are, you know, we're carrying this identity, and particularly to frame it in this maybe simplistic way, our identity is the way others see us and the way we see ourselves, and this kind of constant negotiation of that. And we have student athletes coming to, I'll use my institution, and many of the institutions I've been at, all historically white, predominantly white, that they're coming in and you serve a particular role, and that role becomes racialized as you don't see yourself in a lot of other spaces represented in that way. And so, but when you're in athletics, all of a sudden there's this proliferation of Black faces. And so is my role to be, as a Black person on this campus, an athlete? And that you start to carry that and try to negotiate that in spaces such as the classroom, in spaces, even the community at large, right? Walking off the campus grounds into the community, you know, am I still kind of the tokenized, racialized athlete? And how do I have to operate and function? So you carry your sense of Blackness possibly to this idea that my Black identity, my worth and my value is associated to this craft, which can be stifling if you find that empowering. But you walk into a classroom and where there becomes great ego and great, you know, sense of self in one space, but then in another space, it can kind of cause one to crouch in the back to try to hide, although you might be the, you know, the 6'5", 320 offensive lineman or something, you know, or any other sport, right? Wearing the gear, there's this sense of trying to hide however that may manifest itself. So not to be called on, so not to be a representative in certain ways. And that becomes, I think, in ways it can truncate someone's experience educationally and overemphasize the athletic experience. And so why am I here? Sometimes it's literally, you start to now associate it to, I'm just trying to get the eligibility. I'm just trying to get through the courses. I'm just trying to get to game day. And by the end of this, what else did I get out of this experience? Again, now we've participated in our own kind of self-stereotyping and so forth, but it's in concert with how others are stereotyping ourselves and racializing the Black body on campus.
Absolutely right. I mean, you talk about, you know, the racialization of the experience, and you're right. We know that race also contours, you know, how identity shows up, right, for athletes. And I often remind people when they try to talk about athletes just as athletes and not seeing their Blackness, you know, I remind people that Black athletes wear their uniform of Blackness way more than they wear their uniforms that are associated with a team or a university. And so oftentimes that also makes their racial identity more salient because it's not something they could just take off and disassociate with. And so I appreciate you, you know, providing the ways in which it's all woven together to impact identity and their sense of belonging and what they're trying to navigate to be in a place, as Dr. Dortch mentioned to us earlier, that they're already feeling displaced because they're not at home and they're trying to deal with this identity diffusion or the cognitive dissonance. And so, you know, I think it's important that we have this conversation so that people understand the dynamics and the challenges, which is why I wanted to address some of the nuances. I want to go to you, Dr. Cooper. You've also done research pertaining to identity and some of the other, but I want you to talk about the miseducation and connect that to the underdevelopment that you speak of that Black athletes are suffering from to a greater extent than other students and other athletes.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong, for the question. And my response ties into Dr. Dortch's, Dr. Bimper, and even your comments. The way that through my research, the way that I've began to think about it is, even before we get to talk about identity, when it comes to being Black within the United States, we've got to have the conversation, and Dr. Dortch alluded to this around the dehumanization, about our humanity. And for Black athletes, the challenge, or as I would say, Black holistic athletes who've been, in some cases, miseducated and holistically underdeveloped, and many others who've been properly educated and holistically developed, the idea of wearing the uniform is access to humanity and human treatment. So I take it even a step beyond just identity as to why our experiences, the post-athletic career, identity crisis, the disengagement trauma, the reason why it's so much more compounded is because of the conditions facing Black people beyond the campus, beyond the ivory tower. For a lot of Black college athletes, they're miseducated when they're told that the only value that you have at this institution is to score a touchdown, make a basket, run fast. And you are not here to be educated. You're not here to build relationships. Dr. Bimper's work talks a lot about socially sustaining capital. One of the biggest benefits of going to an institution of higher learning is not just what you learn in the classroom, but it's access to networks. Those networks can help facilitate opportunities for careers, for access to different information that could help transform your family's lives. So for me, the miseducation is not only at the institutional level, but at the societal level. From the founding of this country until now, we've been told that we're subhuman. And in our society, the only way that certain power structures have provided us with some resemblance of human treatment is when we're providing a service to that power structure. So in the case of sports, you get fans that adore you and clap for you and who will celebrate you. But if you have something going on mental health wise, if you want to pursue becoming an engineer or a medical doctor, no, you can't do that. That is a part of, like Dr. Dortch said, the dehumanization, is that you only serve one function, one purpose, which essentially is a form of commodification and objectification. So I think the miseducation happens well before we step on college campuses. It's in our curriculum in the K through 12 schooling. The fact that we don't have a proper education around African-American history, around African history. Much of the curriculum is Eurocentric. The fact that we still have systemic poverty, the fact that we don't have access to wealth in the same ways, all of that's a part of the miseducation. And from an athletic standpoint, if you begin to internalize that, you say the only way I can be a human is to put everything, my all, into athletics. I'm not going to study and understand the system. I'm not going to ask questions about, well, why aren't there more Black athletic directors like Dr. Bimper? Why aren't there more Black commissioners? Why aren't there more Blacks who own professional sport leagues? Why am I taking a class just to major in eligibility instead of pursuing something that I'm interested in or doing work that really can empower and help my community? All of that is a part of the miseducation process. Mm-hmm. Socialization.
Well said. I mean, I really, y'all are making me feel pretty good, like all this connectedness, right, that you all have that's overlapping. And I really appreciate it, because I think that this is the type of enriched conversation we need to have. So Dr. Martin, I want you to talk about, when we continue the context of nuancing the Black student athlete experience, particularly at predominantly white institutions, I want you to talk about racial socialization and how racial socialization and the centrality of race in sport, it really impacts Black students in a way that it doesn't impact other students. So talk about racial socialization and the centrality of race to the Black student athlete experience.
Yeah, so one thing I think is important to note is that when we think about sports, that we should think about it as a social institution. So some people, when they think about sports, they just think about it as being a form of entertainment, escapism. And so you have those folks who will say they don't want politics in their sports without recognizing that sports and politics have always been intertwined. And so as a institution, that means that sports are going to be impacted by all of the isms that impact the society more broadly, whether that's sexism, whether that's racism, ableism, whatever the case might be. And so one of the functions that social institutions play is that they help to communicate the ways of society and to teach us how to be human and what the expectations are for us. And there are various agents of socialization, including families, including schools like colleges and universities, and sports play an important role as well. And so very early on, young people are racially socialized in terms of what sports are appropriate for various racial groups. This literature in sociology on racial socialization is oftentimes used in the context of Black families, for example, telling their kids, you know, that they can be all they can be, but at the same time letting them know that they live in an unequal world, and so they, you know, to teach them how to navigate that. I have tried to apply this concept of racial socialization to understanding sport determination, what sports people end up playing. And we can see that at early ages, you might find people from different racial groups in, you know, playing basketball together, playing soccer together. You got little boys and little girls playing together. And then as you get older, and very early, this starts where people are associating sports that are more sports with Black people, for example, and then associating other sports with members of the dominant group. And, you know, and there are unfortunately some people who still believe that some groups are, you know, biologically more suited for some sports as to others, instead of taking into account issues like access. You know, there are lots of places and ways that, you know, if you have few resources that you can, you know, play basketball, and you don't need a whole lot of people to do that. Some schools, you know, in under-resourced communities don't have even, you know, tracks, for example, so they can't have a track team, or, you know, they don't have green space, so there's no cross-country team. And you don't find a whole lot of full-size swimming pools and hockey rinks in inner city communities. So, you know, all those things come into play. We can't just focus on whether, you know, people are just making these individual choices about what sports to play and so forth, but that there are these structures in place that play an important role in determining how we understand certain sports, why we associate some sports, again, like basketball with Black people, and why we associate, you know, things like swimming and diving and hockey with white people. And so it is critically important to understand that, you know, it's not by happenstance that you find at PWIs that more than half of the students in high revenue generating sports are Black people. There's a whole history to that we need to account for.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you, you know, bringing in the ways in which race, place, and sport intersect. Because, you know, understanding the neighborhood dynamics, population demographics, all of these things intersect with sport that create these patterns that we see that filter Black student athletes into certain sports. So I really appreciate that conversation. So thank you all for, you know, illuminating the different issues, you know, that are unique to Black student athletes. And it's not to say that other student athletes, you know, don't experience them, but because of systemic racism and all the things that you all have just talked about, the impact is much more dramatic for the Black student athlete, which really compounds and complicates their experience in the classroom and as athletes in this athletic enterprise. So we've talked about some of the issues, and now I want to start to sort of shift the conversation to getting closer to some of the solutions, and you inferred some of them. But, you know, one of the primary reasons that I wanted to do this webinar was to bring the essence of the Black Lives Matter movement into higher education. And so just for a second, I just want to revisit what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about. And then I want us to talk about how do we do that? How do we bring the essence of those principles into higher education? So I want to just read a few things. When we talk about Black Lives Matter, you know, it's one of those movements that's often distorted to mean something else. And so that we're on the same page, let me just read a few of the principles of the Black Lives Matter movement. We are unapologetically Black in our positioning. In affirming that Black Lives Matter, we need not qualify our position. To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a prerequisite for one and the same for others. We're committed to struggling together and to imagining and creating a world free of anti-Blackness, where every Black person has the social, economic, and political power to thrive. Every day we recommit to healing ourselves and each other, and to co-creating alongside our comrades, our allies, in a family culture where every person feels seen, heard, and respected. We acknowledge, respect, and celebrate differences and commonalities. We work vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people, and by extension, all people. We intentionally build and nurture a beloved community that is bonded together through a beautiful struggle that is restorative and not depleted. Now, let me say that again. A struggle in a community that's restorative and not depleted. So that's what brings us to the subtitle, or part of the title is restorative justice. If we've already articulated the ills and the harms that racial injustices have caused Black student athletes. So in the spirit of restorative justice, it's about healing. It's not about punishment necessarily. It's about healing. It's about identifying the harms and trying to repair the harms. But it also holds people accountable. But it involves the individuals and the institution in creating healthy, holistic relationships. And so that's what I want to talk about next, is that we talked about the ills. We know, racism, we know it is a public health crisis. Racism is traumatic. You all have already elucidated that. And so given that, restorative justice offers a way for racial healing. So I want to talk about how do we bring restorative justice into higher education? And what I want to do is I want to begin with talking about how we need to empower our student athletes to take an active role in their own liberation in the classrooms and in the competition. So I want to open it up to talking about how do we empower the student athletes. And I actually want to begin with you, Dr. Dortch. Dr. Cooper alluded to it earlier. You know, one of the things we need to do when we talk about the academy is decolonize the curriculum to eliminate the anti-Black, and the racist pedagogy and content. So I want you, Dr. Dortch, when we talk about what do we need to change, how do we get to the space of restorative justice, talk to us about the role of inclusive instruction in empowering Black student athletes to be fully involved, fully engaged.
Thank you for the question. I'll just start off by saying that white supremacist philosophies and anti-Black racism is the most pervasive danger to our educational system. And colleges and universities usually take a race-neutral position, which is damaging for all of us, and especially towards the movement for racial equity and justice. When we think about how we can be more inclusive in our work, institutions really need to think about, so I'm gonna say something.
Hey, we're family, we're family.
That's gonna be controversial and that every institution could do, but won't. So I teach a class, for most people who don't know, I teach a class on like university governance, right? So I spend a lot of time looking at how universities are structured and how they function and how decisions are made, right? We spend a lot of time talking about university decision making. And what we know about university mission statements, they're real generic, right? You can take the name off of most of them and they all look exactly the same. Well, they're generic for a reason, because whatever you put in your mission statement, you have a duty to uphold. And so what that means is that you can be sued if you do not uphold what's in your mission statement. So imagine, my goodness, imagine if institutions were to actually say, we are striving anti-racist institutions. Imagine, what would that look like? Well, then if in their mission statement, they said we are an active or striving anti-racist institution, then that trickles down to every single policy and practice, the curriculum, the hiring, the access, the recruitment. It becomes like a 4, 5, 6-pronged process in which all stems back to the mission statement, right? But rather than doing that, institutions might have programs that might have language that says something about social justice, or they might have even a department with a mission statement that says we care about social justice, or even go as far as a college inside of a university. But rarely, if ever, do you see a university mission statement that has that kind of language. Now, when that begins to happen, if that ever happens, then we can say, okay, now let's look at every single process that we have. So until that happens, it is really, really difficult to be able to make universities systemic transformation that moves toward racial justice and inclusion. Mm-hmm. Does that mean you can't do anything? No, you can certainly work within your own sphere of influence, right? So for student athletes who are interested and invested in their spaces outside of their sport, so meaning inside of the classroom, they have some say in terms of what they are learning, right? So it's always best, in my opinion, not only in my opinion, but what the research tells us is it's better to move in critical mass when you have collective masses working together, right? So if you have a board of trustees that is interested in making changes, the change will be made. I have seen it with my own eyes. If you have a president that says, all right, these are the changes that are made, and then a provost that says, these are the changes that we're going to make. If we are centering racial justice and equity and inclusion, if we really believe that that is our focus and our primary focus from here on out, then we will see these changes being made in writing, full stop. But what often happens is we see symbolic changes, right? So because a symbolic change, those are easy to do, right? To change a name on a building, right? To do some value signaling, to say, oh, okay, let's change the name of this building. Let's hire, maybe put this Black person in this spot. But those changes aren't systemic in nature. Those changes don't create policy change, which inevitably would change practice. But to go back to your original question about how can we move toward curricular changes, is students can sort of band together and have conversations with their faculty about what it is that they want to learn. They do have some agency in that. And faculty can also, especially for institutions that practice shared governance, can also make decisions about the ways in which they include and incorporate scholars who are typically on the margins and place them in the center. Mm-hmm. And so when we all take responsibility, both Black faculty, staff, and students, and non-Black faculty, staff, and students, and there's more of them than there are of us, when we all make it our collective responsibility to do that work and really do that work, then we'll start to see movements, whether that be paying us equitably, because Lord knows how many workshops and things people have asked me to do for free, right? That they would typically pay a white person to do. If we begin in terms of the recruitment, in terms of recruitment and hiring, those practices right now are fundamentally racist, which is why institutions keep hiring the same people over and over and over again and have no intentions of changing unless we have people who are positioned strategically who can help exercise some of those changes.
Mhm.
And so that was a really long answer to your question. I hope I answered it completely, but right now we're in this moment where we have there's a lot of momentum in this Black Lives Matter moment, which is a movement. And so my hope is that we can continue this momentum for our good, for equity and justice and racial transformation in much more positive ways.
No, that was a excellent response, but I don't remember the controversial part. Like, you're good. I heard nothing wrong with what you said, so thank you. And I actually want to go to Dr. Bimper based on something Dr. Dortch mentioned. She's talking about, what we value and what we see. And I want to go back just a second. In some of the classes that I teach, when I have black student athletes and the content is something that they can relate to and it's not pedagogy that's marginalizing them, I clearly see the genius in them be excavated. And so, I don't want us to underestimate when we talk about the student athlete experience, we talk about miseducation and all these other imposter syndrome. I think part of our role as faculty in higher education is to engage them in the conversations, to have pedagogy that involves them and does not marginalize them and further colonize them, because that's what happens in many regards. So that's a part of restorative justice, is creating a space that's healing and holistic and that allows them to be able to thrive. So I want to go to you, Dr. Bimper. Colorado State was one of the few athletic departments to really hire an athletic director with responsibilities in diversity and inclusion. Like, they're popping up, they're like popcorn now. They're all over the place. Like, everyone's doing it, right? And so I want you to talk about how, number one, tell me if that particular role is a way to offer restorative justice to Black student athletes. And then I have a follow-up question. What about universities that don't have a person like Dr. Bimper? Well, first of all, there is no other Dr. Bimper. Let me just say that. You are one of a kind. But first of all, talk about this role as a way of providing restorative justice to Black student athletes.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. If I may, I begin that my role came out of a reactive moment, unfortunately, like many do. And so, but the reaction was, or the catalyst was, we had former Black athletes that had organized a conversation with our university leadership, athletic and university leadership, and asking the most basic question of what are we doing for Black athletes now? The alumni had been long removed from their athletic experience at the institution, and we're very curious about what are we doing for Black athletes now? And that question wasn't, the answer to that question was not received very well. And, at its most basic level, it was replied as, we didn't know we had to kind of think about that specifically. And so that in of itself became the catalyst for the university at the time reaching out to me. And it was an effort by our former university president, an effort by our vice president of student affairs, right? University leadership asking, okay, that was unsatisfactory, and we now need to put a structure in place to figure out how to in a long-term way, improve our efforts. And so I'm appreciative of that. And yeah, that was about 7 years ago for us. And so I've been in this role nearly 7 years. And I came in as a senior associate athletic director for diversity and inclusion explicitly and specifically. So, which was, I described a little bit as a lone wolf position across the NCAA. The NCAA wondering, who is this dude and what does he do? And other schools asking the same question, myself asking, all right, now what do we do? But I do think it's a step towards the restorative justice, and that restorative justice is not just kind of the fly by night programs, but there has to be a structure in place that can sustain itself. And is that just hiring people? No, but it's thinking about the multiple pieces to put together, which will include hiring folks in certain positions. I am excited that I'm not, quote unquote, a lone wolf in this in this game anymore, and in this industry of late, and concerned at the same time that folks with a lot of passion are being tapped to take on a position without the resources, without kind of full support, without kind of a lot of strategy behind what they're going to do, and that may be more dangerous than productive. To offer a statement of caution. But from the structure, though, we've then partnered with our campus in ways that existed before me, and we've continued to do and evolve, is partner with other areas on campus, including various aspects of student affairs, including faculty, thinking about not just mentor programs that need to be created, but undergraduate research programs that need to be uniquely designed for access opportunities of our student athletes of color. Because walking out of here with a 2.0 ain't gonna do you a lot of good if you're trying to get into grad school sometimes. And so, or not having a full resume that's either academic or not. What are some of the other career opportunities and internship and externship type opportunities? Like, trying to think of it very systematically across our institution. I think having someone in place gives value that can start to really design the unit and then design the efforts that center race, equity, inclusive excellence, and so forth. And I came in, I tell institutions that call me all the time that I came in by myself, and that wasn't the smartest thing to do. And so we built out an assistant director. We have graduate students that are specifically working on diversity and inclusion from the athletics department, and working with all of our units in the athletic department. So it's not just me ringing the bell, but it's building it into meeting agendas in our development office and fundraising. It's being part of the conversation in sales and ticketing and marketing. It's being part of the conversations in our creative services, where we're creating graphics and all these things. Like, the conversation doesn't just exist in a program designed just to affect the student athletes, right? It's the student athletes in concert with the staff, in concert with our systems and programs, in concert with the other parts of campus, that our student athletes, as many have acknowledged here, the holistic village is not just within the realms of our building that just have the logo behind me on it, right? But it has to be in every unit of the campus. And I'd also add that the structure extends even into understanding our industry. It extends even into our donors. And so being able to be in front of our donors, maybe I'm the one initiating the conversation a few years ago, but we've gotten to a point where our senior AD for development can now have the conversation where I'm not gonna be. And so I think that's where structure is important, and designed in a lot of different ways, understanding that the athletes are gonna need mentorship. We're gonna have to create programs where they have the opportunity to talk and engage. But they're going to need advocacy, again, in the spaces where they're not going to always be. If I finish on one last point, unique kind of programmings and giving them voice to see themselves in the quote unquote curriculum as I implemented in athletics. We spent a semester talking about agriculture, and my student athletes in our program we have is our John Mosley Leadership Program. John Mosley was our first African-American football player to graduate in 1943. Imagine the world in 1943. And he was one of 7 African-Americans on our campus, went on to become a Tuskegee Airman and served his community when he came back to the Denver area. So we build a program in his legacy. And one of the ways is to connect programs and content that we think is important to student athletes, but we need them to see themselves in that content. And so we talked about agriculture, and they said, "Doc, this ain't me." And I said, "It might be closer to you than you think it is." And we started talking about how communities are seen and unseen through agriculture, connecting it to Flint, Michigan, and how a community was seen and unseen through even water. And if you want to go back and start your nonprofit organizations, it's one thing to start a basketball program, but to have effect on community, you're going to build boards of directors, and they're going to want to know, how does this really implement the community? And the ways in which you can articulate how communities are seen and unseen, that gives our student athletes it gave them a sense of empowerment and like an aha moment of like, wow, I can do even more than just play ball, and start other organizations that just play ball, not to diminish those nonprofits. I started them myself when I went to the league. But the opportunity for them to engage in other topics. And we talked about food deserts, and they're like, Doc, I don't understand what a food desert is. And I said, well, it's growing up and seeing that food last all the way almost to the end of 3 weeks, and you got one more week in the month to get by, right? And it's living month to month. And they said, oh, that language makes sense to me, and that experience makes sense to me for some of them. And others were like, no, I absolutely understand the benefits of not living in a food desert, because they're not a monolithic group. Some of them grew up next to the Whole Foods and grew up next to the Trader Joe's and grew up next to the Sprouts. And they see Fort Collins as a place that resembles that. And they couldn't make the connection to someone that was in absence of that. So that's what our programming and our curriculum is trying to do, to connect, but it does need to have structure, and it can't really reside with one person. And I hope the folks that are taking these roles will be thinking about the budget to accomplish the things that they need to do, the resources and the collaboration it will take to tackle some of the very difficult issues, where even us, we feel good about some of the programming and know we need to build, but we're not the best in hiring. And that's a hard challenge that I've been trying to undertake here. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I hope that kind of gets at some of your question.
No, I understand the comprehensive nature of your response, and I think it's a direct reflection of the comprehensive nature of your program. So, and I know you've received awards for what you've done, so kudos. I think your model is one of the ones that other universities should look at, is how do you really impart a system in a comprehensive manner that's, as Dr. Dortch has mentioned, not just symbolic in title, right? But it also it's impactful in its effect. And I think you're doing a great job. I want to talk to Dr. Martin, and then and I'll get you, Dr. Cooper, to close it out for us. Dr. Martin, another way of trying to ensure restorative justice, for Black student athletes, is the role of the faculty athletic representative. Like I play that role here at the University of Michigan, and I love it. I'm so proud of our student athletes. Like, they make my job easy because I'm so proud of what they do. But I want you, for those who don't know the role of the faculty athletic representative, talk to them about that role in ensuring the health and well-being of student athletes, and that includes racial and social justice.
Yeah, if I could just first make a comment about student athletes and the things that they're doing in this moment. And again, I mentioned the Black student athletes at LSU and how they recently formed an organization. Among the list of things that they're asking from the administration is that all students at LSU be required to take an African and African American studies course. And so while we're still working out the details on that, that has led to us including service learning as an option. So there's more community engagement with a larger Black community surrounding the campus, and also to explore dual enrollment so that, high school students can take college courses that can help them when they transition into higher education. And, we're discovering that in the local public school system, there's only one course that even resembles a race relations course. And so all this is happening because the Black student athletes have demanded it. And so I'm proud that that's happening at LSU and in other places. And I'm also proud to serve as their faculty athletics representative, as you mentioned. And the duties may vary at different institutions and different divisions, for example, but as you noted, one of my responsibilities is to monitor and the health and well-being of student athletes, also to maintain the academic integrity and to ensure that the institution is compliant with SEC and NCAA regulations. In this moment, I feel very honored to serve in this capacity because it's allowed me an opportunity to be part of discussions in the athletic department about how to move forward and how to make the department a more welcoming place for Black athletes, as well as for Black staff, for example. And so I'm pleased that, at least individuals at all levels within the administration have been been open to not only just, reading books that are popular in the larger society right now, but also starting to think about, where they're spending their money, to what extent can they increase their engagement with diverse vendors, for example. And so it's really been an honor. And it also has provided me with the opportunity to advise the Black Student Association, the Black Student Association, with some other people within the department. And so what's also critical is that it also presents me with an opportunity to work with other FARs within the SEC where LSU is located. And then recently there was a webinar with FARs from all over Division I. And so most FARs do not have the kind of academic training or record that I have. That's at least been my experience. And so I think it's critically important that scholars who study race and sports are at the table. We may not be able to change policies as much within the conferences. Sometimes that power stays with the athletic directors and with the presidents, but at our various institutions, I think that that's where we're able to have the greatest impact. So I chair an athletic council that includes alumni, includes representatives from student government, includes individuals from the president's office and other places. And I chair another committee that includes individuals from all across campus if they have any dealings with student athletes. It really is a unique opportunity to be a liaison between the academic side of campus and the athletic side of campus. And as being a Black woman who's a full professor, I was in a unique position to even be eligible to fill that role. And so I think, just to add, that's why it's critically important that we have more Black faculty on campus and that we retain them so that they are able to be in a position that they're even eligible to serve as a faculty athletic representative or in some other capacity. So this, the timing is just right for me to be where I am, and I really appreciate the opportunity to support the things that the Black student athletes want to do that they perhaps can't accomplish because it takes having to navigate all of the bureaucracy and red tape that is so characteristic of higher education. And so again, I'm honored to serve them.
Right. It's such a critical role, because it's an advocate for student athletes who's located outside of athletics. And so they can have a sense of freedom. Lastly, as we get ready to wind down, because I got two hot topics that we have to talk about. But before we move to that, Dr. Cooper, you want to put a bow on this one for us and tell us what restorative justice looked like for the Black student athletes at predominantly white institutions?
Absolutely. So when I think about restorative justice, as you read the definition earlier, similar to the broader conversation around reparations for African Americans in our society, there has to be a recognition and an acknowledgement of the harm that has been done. So we have to acknowledge that athletic exploitation, particularly at Division I institutions, has been done. The principle of amateurism, and the disparate impact that it's had on Black college athletes, where you have coaches making millions of dollars. I believe at one report, Nick Saban was making 14 times what the University of Alabama president was making. So you're talking about millions upon millions of dollars, and even in the billions, if you look at the March Madness tournament over a period of years, that's being generated by institutions, by corporate sponsors, by other entities, and a majority of these college athletes are not going to matriculate to the professional level. So in terms of their earning potential off of their athletic ability, at the college level, that's the highest time for them, yet they're not receiving equitable compensation. And once again, we can get into the conversation around the type of quality education that they're receiving. So one, we have to recognize that the system is problematic. I don't use the term the system is broken because many of us know the system is working exactly the way it was designed to work. So I liked how you mentioned earlier about decolonizing the curriculum. We need to decolonize our athletic departments. We need to decolonize college sports. We need to decolonize the United States of America. And so what that looks like there's various ways to look at it, but I think it gets into representation, resource allocation, and results. If you change the composition of the decision makers and who's represented, that will change the dialogue and the discourse that's taking place when policies are created. When you're talking about resource allocations, there needs to be a level of race consciousness about the resource allocations, right? If there has been undue harm to particular groups, that means the repair will mean that there'll be a disproportionate amount of resources allocated there. And it's not just in the form of cash payments. It could be in the form of educational trust funds. It could be creating leadership programs like Dr. Bimper's at Colorado State, Dr. Dortch's and Dr. Carter Francique's at Texas A&M. That could be a form of restorative justice, investing in culturally responsive programming. And then ultimately it comes down to results, right? If you still, at my previous institution at UConn in 2013, I believe, the UConn men's basketball team was banned from the NCAA tournament for having consecutive seasons of not graduating at least half of the players. One of the things that I think would be a restorative justice that could perhaps get some of the attention of these institutions is that their postseason bans if the racial gap in graduation rates is beyond a certain point. I find it extremely egregious that if you look at some of the March Madness teams and the Bowl Championship Series teams, when you see the gaps in the white player graduation rates and the black graduation rates, yet the millions upon millions of dollars are still being poured into these institutions, there has to be some kind of penalty for that, right? If all of us are valuing, back to the notion of equity and inclusion, if we value all of our college athletes, then why are we okay with those graduation gaps along racial lines existing? So I think representation, resources, and results are one way of doing it. And then I'm sure with the remaining time that we have, we could talk about different ways in which we can activate resistance and different types of activism in the event that those type of structural changes are not are taking place.
Right, and you know, you teed me off there. You kind of peeked on my sheet here. I was going to ask, and the whole notion. So we're talking about restorative justice, right? And I appreciate all of what you all have offered. We tried to talk about it with you, Dr. Dortch, looking at the notion of the curriculum, because looking at the academy, we know that systemic racism is embedded there. We know it is. And with Dr. Bimper, you know, I wanted you to also address what happens in athletics when there's a dedicated person doing dedicated work. How does that impact the experiences of the Black student athletes? And with you, Dr. Martin, the NCAA is designated that we need someone outside of athletics to ensure that things are going right. And so we have some systems in place. But one of the things that I want to talk about, because we are one, this is just, first of all, this is so not enough time for us to talk about the depth and the wealth of information that we have. But I want to talk about another way that we see systemic racism impact the Black community and thus Black student athletes is that there's not generational wealth in the Black community, right? And so you alluded to it, Dr. Cooper. Would restorative justice suggest that we should be able to provide Black student athletes with some compensation for their talents in athletics, be it with the name, image, and likeness that the NCAA is grappling with right now, or the notion of pay to play? Now, I want to go to you, Dr. Martin, to give us the Cliff Notes version, because you got a whole book on this topic. You've written about it, but talk about the concept of paying athletes to play as an element of restorative justice to ensure generational economic wealth.
You know, I think the first thing to note is that it really demythologizes what Dr. Cooper talked about with regards to amateurism. I mean, if anybody was watching the last season and checking out Duke, you knew that it was clear that Zion Williamson had no business playing in the NCAA, but he didn't have the option really because of the way in which the system is structured. And I think more broadly, we've had wealth inequality in this country, again, to Dr. Cooper's point, before the country was even even found it, and that and different public policies have helped to privilege some groups as opposed to others. And again, because that's happening in the society at large, we shouldn't be surprised when we see that it's happening in the world of sports as well. And so it's not a coincidence that you start to see, Black athletes on predominantly white campuses around the same time that you start having these big the television contracts, and you see integrated teams are doing big things. Dr. Bimper mentioned that their first Black graduate was in the 1940s, and the SEC, we're talking about the late 1960s, early 70s, which was not that long ago. So we just have to be real about, the role that money plays and the role that Black bodies have played in sports and on high revenue generating sports in particular. And so it's oftentimes frustrating when you have some people who want to have this head in the sand, philosophy where they act like they don't know what you're talking about. They got their fingers in their ears, and what you're saying just can't, makes no sense. And the rest of us who have actually, studied this and observed how these dynamics work, recognize that this is the problem. And yes, it's not easy to fix. And we know that there are lots of people who benefit. So it's not even just the coaches who are benefiting, but many of these college towns are suffering with the coronavirus, with campuses being closed. People plan their vacations, their weddings, their lives around football in some regions. But the point is that just because it's not easy doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen. And it's important to try to reimagine a different system where people are, paid their fair market value. And we don't use the excuse, which is so frustrating to me, that it's okay to exploit some people because it benefits others. It's not okay to exploit athletes in high revenue generating sports because you're concerned about what's going to happen to the non-generating sports. That is not okay. And that is, really indicative of the larger problem about not only, whether we value Black bodies. We've already seen that for much of American history that, Black bodies have not been valued. But when we think and think about it in a different way, as some of my colleagues have put forth, is in what ways have they mattered? And so, yeah, they matter when it comes down to the wealth that can be built, from their blood, sweat, and tears, but they don't matter when it comes to adequately compensating them for the use of their images and, for their labor. And there's just nowhere else in American society where anyone would tolerate doing the kinds of things that we demand of Black student athletes in particular, and not get compensated for what they're worth. And so it's really, as I mentioned previously, it's time to pay to play.
So again, I know you all probably have comments on that, but unfortunately, we got to move to the next one. But I agree with you, and Dr. Bimper particularly, I know you write a lot about neoliberalism and how this profit motive really is driving the academy, so much so that social justice, racial justice is kicked aside. And so as you just mentioned, Dr. Martin, and you alluded to as well, Dr. Cooper, we know that there's a profit motive, but we also know that race plays a part in this conversation, because the majority of the student athletes who are the key players in the revenue sports are really mostly Black males. And so there is a racial component. So it's interesting to see how the conversations actually differ, oftentimes along racial lines, and we know that. I want to talk about one other thing, and I want to open up to you as we try to wind it down in respect to all of your time and the time of our audience. You mentioned, Dr. Martin, we're in a unique crisis. We are in unique crises, plural. We have the COVID-19, but we still have this ever burgeoning crisis of systemic racism. Many campuses are still sort of kind of hoping that we can have sports. So in the spirit of restorative justice, bringing Black athletes and having Black bodies on the front line during this COVID season, is that an element of restorative justice, or is that smack in the face of restorative justice? So talk about, because we know Black athletes are suffering mentally higher than other student athletes. So talk about where we are in this moment with the COVID and with racism, and what it means for Black student athletes to feel pressured, and for many universities to sort of suggest, strongly encourage that they come back and somehow we have sports. I'm going to open it up to whoever wants to answer.
If you don't mind, I'd like to start.
Yes.
You're sending my pressure up. My blood pressure is going up right now.
So I don't want that.
Personally, I think it's disgusting. It is disgusting, and it spits in the face of restorative justice, first of all, to put Black and brown bodies on the field when we already know scientifically that we are disproportionately impacted by this disease, right? And we are the ones essentially dying from this thing. And then to risk a student's life like that. There's no cure for this thing. We don't know how long we're gonna have it, but even the idea of it's your life or this sport, like students should not have to make these types of decisions, nor should these types of decisions be put upon students to have to make. I think it makes absolutely no sense to me. But I do understand why universities are doing it, because they don't fundamentally care about Black people ultimately. And so because they don't care about us, nor our bodies or our health or our education, they simply only care about how much money we can make for them. But they themselves would not put their own children on the front lines. They themselves would not send their own students to go play these athletics, these sports in which could essentially kill them. They would not do that. And so it is really frustrating to me. This whole COVID situation has been frustrating for me in the sense that why institutions haven't come at it from like a healthcare perspective. It's been all about dollars and cents. How much money will we lose if we go online 100%, as opposed to how many lives we would save if we did, right? And so that has been the attitude moving forward. And so to have this conversation about, are we still going to have contact sports? To what end? To the benefit of what, right? So that all of these kids can die? Like, it frustrates me to no end, as someone who cares about justice, as someone who cares about Black lives, as someone who cares about people in general. How on earth could anyone fathom sending people deliberately in harm's way?
Right. So listen, I'm sorry. I agree, and I'm sure many of the other panelists, you share that sentiment, but unfortunately, we're out of time. But what I want you to do, we just have a few minutes left, and if you had one nugget that you could offer our audience, you know, some one takeaway, something they can do, a call to action, one nugget that would help them join this fight for restorative justice for Black athletes, what would that one thing be? And I'll start with you, Dr. Bimper.
I guess I would offer maybe similar to the comments I've shared before, and I'll just speak to structure, as I think a lot of the issues, we need to assess them at an individual level, a structural and systematic levels. And so I guess I'll just offer the nugget of structure that while we want programs, while we want different policy and language, this stuff comes about by structures that can support it and structures that can evolve through it. I think they can also endure, because those structures won't be perfect in their first creations or iterations. And so the ways in which those structures can be amended. And so I'm encouraged by the pursuit of structural design, universal design by many institutions in the current Black Lives Matter movement and moment of institutions. But I'd encourage the grad students on the call, I'd encourage the administrators, the faculty, to think about how to better design the structure that can support all the creative ideas that may come about.
Okay, very good, thank you. So structure. Dr. Cooper, what's your one nugget, quickly?
I would say the mantra is, everyone, your actions and your inactions change the world every day. So what you resist and what you reproduce, what you fight against, what you accept, that matters. So that would be kind of my one takeaway related to an action is let engage our Black college athletes in the solutions that we're trying to present. A lot of times we just want to create ideas and put it upon them. They have great ideas about what could best support them holistically. So let's engage in more direct engagement, working collaboratively and data-driven practices.
Very good. Thank you. Dr. Martin, one nugget.
I think that we just really need to support Black athletes by saying something when we see something that is unjust, and that means going to individuals within the athletic department and stating what the challenges are and trying to develop strategies for addressing them, because we can't ignore the fact that even though students may feel very empowered now that the structure still is in place, that places them at a great disadvantage. So there are concerns about retribution and retaliation. And so while some Black student athletes may want to be more vocal and engage in different activities, they oftentimes have a lot to lose. And so I understand that if they make a calculated decision about what they're going to do or not do. But for those of us that are in a position where, maybe we're tenured, and even that's tenuous, but if we're in a position where we can actually try to, raise the volume on their voices, then we should do everything within our power.
Wonderful. Last but not least, Dr. Dortch, give us your one nugget.
I would say harness your collective power. There are power in numbers. And so where you might feel alone in something, you are not. There are other people who share your passion and your vision. And so tap into those people to try to make the structural changes that are necessary, or even the individual or personal ones. So you all can exercise racial agency, whether that be through your writing, right? Writing is a revolutionary act. And so you can do that either through your writing or public speaking, or just having a conversation with your friends. So that would be my one nugget. And the last thing that I'll just say is that, this work is hard and it's tiring and it's laborious and it's taxing. And sometimes it feels impossible, but it always seems impossible until it's done. Oh, that's
wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you all so much for the wealth of information and insight that you've shared with us. I really wish we had more time. But, I want to say really quickly, we are in a special and unique moment. Like our Black athletes are like, they're in the movement. Cheryl Richards tells us that people start to feel healed, but people start to heal when they feel that they're being heard. People start to heal when they feel they're being heard. And our athletes are screaming, like they want to be heard. They're screaming Black Lives Matter. And not only do they want us to hear them, but we have to scream with them. We have to scream with them literally and figuratively. Sort of like Dr. Dortch mentioned, in what we do in the academy, if we're a coach, if we're faculty, if we're a lecturer, if we're athletic administrator, if we're an associate dean, whatever the role is, we have to be in this moment. And Angela Davis told us it's not enough just to be non-racist. We got to be anti-racist. And one of my favorite philosophers from back in like the 1900s, William James, he says, most people think they are thinking, but they're merely rearranging their prejudices. Most people think they are thinking, but they're really rearranging their prejudices. And in the spirit of restorative justice, I think it's incumbent on all of us to challenge, to rearrange and recycle race-based prejudices that have impacted Black student athlete experience. We all have a role to play in this process. And so I just want to encourage you. I hope we've stretched your minds to new dimensions with this webinar. I hope we've not only informed you, but we've inspired you to act, because, change, we can't impart and impact change merely by getting more information, but we impart change when we use that information to inform our purpose, to fuel our passion, and to be empowered to act. And I think we all have to use our platform in higher education, no matter how it is, to act on behalf of our student athletes. They need it and they deserve it. And so in the spirit of restorative justice, You know, we have to identify the harms, and we have to create spaces in our classrooms, on our teams, in our departments, and any other space that's associated with higher education to allow Black student athletes to thrive. Arthur Ashe, the late great activist Arthur Ashe, gave us a really simple recipe. He said, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. So that's my message to you. Get in this game for racial justice, because as the collective, Dr. Dortch just mentioned, there's power in collectiveness. And so I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. Thank you again to my marketing team in the School of Kinesiology. Thank you to the NCID, National Center for Institutional Diversity, for being our partner. Thank you so much, panel. I really appreciate your wisdom, your insight. And to all of you out there in Zoom land, we know you had a choice, but we're glad you decided to spend a portion of your day with us. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay hopeful. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.